Under the Nazi regime, sex was much more than a private matter. It was an active part of their system of control, punishment, and domination. These weren't one-off excesses. It was a sustained policy. From mass rapes on the Eastern Front to brothels in concentration camps, the Nazis used war to unleash a perverse lust, committing acts they concealed as the regime's deepest secrets. What role did sex play in the Third Reich's machinery? What sexual practices did the Third Reich's high command hide? And why are these secrets still kept out of the history books? Bodies taken, raped by the Reich. The German invasion of Poland in September 1939 inaugurated a new type of warfare where sexual violence was integrated as a strategic tool. As the Wehrmacht advanced eastward, the systematic rape of women accompanied the territorial occupation as a mechanism of planned domination. What initially appeared to be individual excesses revealed, under historical scrutiny, a coordinated pattern. In Polish towns and cities, German troops developed an unwritten but consistent protocol: gender separation of the population, targeting of young women, and gang rape in public or private spaces. The Polish government in exile methodically documented these crimes, noting their application to both Jewish and non-Jewish populations. By 1941, Red Cross reports confirmed that these patterns had spread to Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic countries. Racial ideology provided justification for these acts. Classified as inferior races, Slavic and Jewish peoples lacked, under Nazi logic, fundamental protections. Recovered testimonies describe how German soldiers, after perpetrating rapes, would utter phrases such as, "A German woman would never lower herself to you. You should be grateful for the honor I grant you." Physical degradation was thus complemented by psychological humiliation. In 1942, Heinrich Himmler institutionalized these informal practices with a memorandum authorizing the creation of brothels within the concentration camp system. Under the euphemism of Freudenabteilungen, pleasure departments, these establishments made sexual exploitation an official component of the concentration camp regime, completely dehumanizing the victims through formalized administrative procedures. The mechanism operated with bureaucratic precision. SS doctors selected women primarily at Ravensbrück, subjecting them to forced gynecological examinations before transferring them to Auschwitz, Mauthausen, Buchenwald, and Dachau. In specific blocks, with cubicles separated by thin partitions, they were to receive between 4 and 6 men each night. Internal documentation reveals that the average lifespan of these prisoners did not exceed 3 months, after which they were replaced. The system extended beyond the camps. In parallel, the SS established a network of military brothels in occupied territories. Warsaw, Riga, Kiev, Oslo, and other European cities housed facilities where kidnapped, deceived, or coerced women provided services to German troops. Significantly, many of these establishments were located in confiscated religious buildings, adding cultural humiliation to the physical violence. Beginning in the second half of 1942, German labor shortages led to the massive importation of forced laborers from occupied territories. Young Polish, Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian women were transported by the tens of thousands to work in factories, agricultural fields, military hospitals, and private homes. In many cases, the adolescent girls were recruited under false promises or kidnapped during raids, transported in cattle cars, and assigned to employers through the Reich Labor Service, RAD, or the Todt organization. A considerable portion of these women were sent as compulsory domestic staff to the homes of SS officers, local administrative chiefs, or production supervisors. There, in addition to cleaning, cooking, and laundry duties, they were exposed to a closed environment where sexual abuse was common, especially in homes without German female presence. There was no external oversight or reporting channels. Internal Reich legislation considered these workers useful elements in wartime, but did not grant them any legal protections regarding bodily integrity. In several regions, especially in East Prussia, Silesia, and Austria, municipal authorities documented cases where female employees from the East became pregnant and were subsequently transferred to special isolation centers. The purpose was to cover up the scandal without initiating investigations. Many of these young women never returned to their original destinations, and their subsequent whereabouts remained unrecorded. Local administrations avoided filing complaints so as not to damage the image of the employer, especially if they were party members. In industrial settings, the situation was no different. Factories such as Krupp, IG Farben, and Daimler-Benz had separate quarters for forced laborers. Women shared barracks guarded by male foremen who were not accountable to any civilian authority. On night shifts, they were often taken from their beds to serve in supervisors' offices or empty workshops. Rape went unreported. Pregnant women were dismissed from the workplace and sent to makeshift medical facilities where, in some cases, unregistered abortions were performed or premature labor was induced. Had specific disciplinary codes that severely punished female workers for relationships with German men under the pretext of preserving racial purity. However, no equivalent provision existed when the relationship was coercive or when the aggressor was a superior officer. This legal asymmetry served as a free pass for abuse to occur without repercussions. In several female RAD centers, inmates were verbally instructed not to resist if selected, under threat of immediate deportation to the East as punishment for disobedience. The involvement of medical professionals like Dr. Herta Oberhäuser demonstrates the total corruption of medical ethics. Her case, which will be examined in detail in Chapter 6, illustrates how scientific training was perverted to transform suffering into clinical data. Vera Lasker, a Czech Auschwitz survivor, told Allied investigators in 1946, "In the pleasure block, I lost all human identity. We were treated as receptacles, not even as animals. Some prisoners cried afterward, others beat us, many urinated on us, marking their territory. The guards enjoyed our humiliations as much as our bodies." The true extent of these crimes remains largely unknown. Documentary evidence shows that between 1942 and 1945, more than 60,000 women were processed through the military brothel and concentration camp system. This figure excludes undocumented rapes during the initial invasion and subsequent occupations, conservatively estimated at several hundred thousand. The restoration of justice after the war was notably deficient in this area. While the Nuremberg trials devoted extensive sessions to crimes against humanity, sexual violence received peripheral attention. Only 3 individuals directly responsible for the concentration camp brothel system were tried specifically for these crimes. The rest were subsumed under broader categories or simply ignored. Survivors faced additional stigmatization. Often labeled as voluntary prostitutes in post-war Germany, many opted for silence as a social survival strategy. Criminal prosecution of perpetrators was hampered by shame, trauma, and cultural taboos that prevented public disclosure. It wasn't until the 1990s that academic research began to systematically document this dimension of Nazi terror. The legacy of this violence was inscribed not only on individual bodies, but also on the European collective memory. The systematic use of the female body as a battlefield represented the ultimate extension of totalitarianism, state control over even the most absolute intimacy, transforming the sexual act into a brutal manifestation of power. Aryan blood factories, the Lebensborn Project. On December 12, 1935, by confidential administrative decree, Heinrich Himmler established the Lebensborn Foundation, Source of Life. This seemingly charitable initiative concealed an unprecedented eugenics project, the industrialization of motherhood as a tool of racial engineering. If persecution and extermination represented the destructive phase of the Nazi racial program, Lebensborn embodied its constructive dimension. The first facilities opened quietly in Steinhöring, Bavaria, later expanding to a network that included 9 centers across Germany and dozens more in occupied territories. These establishments combined advanced medical services, superior prenatal care, and comfortable surroundings in a time of widespread shortages. Their true purpose, however, went beyond maternal care. They were biological factories for the controlled production of racially valuable human material. Recruitment operated according to strict eugenic criteria. Each candidate underwent genealogical examinations verifying Aryan purity for 3 generations, exhaustive physical evaluations, and detailed anthropometric measurements. Administrative documents reveal specific parameters: minimum height, preferably Nordic coloration, and cranial conformity to predetermined racial standards. Approximately 40% of applicants were rejected for racial deficiencies. The population served comprised 3 distinct categories: wives of SS officers, single women pregnant by SS members, and young women specifically selected for programmed reproduction with selected officers. This last category revealed the most disturbing dimension: administratively arranged encounters with no emotional basis, exclusively oriented toward the production of genetically appropriate offspring. During pregnancy, women received intensive indoctrination. Daily classes covered racial theory, National Socialist principles, and the concept of motherhood as service to the state. The instructors, usually wives of prominent officers, methodically eliminated any notion of motherhood as a personal experience, emphasizing its biological political function. Simultaneously, all medical decisions were subordinated to racial criteria over individual considerations. Birth marked the beginning of the product evaluation. SS doctors thoroughly examined each newborn according to strict racial criteria, documenting their findings on standardized forms. Those deemed racially worthy received official certification, while deficient cases, 7 to 8% according to recovered records, were systematically eliminated, especially in centers in Eastern Europe, although this practice was not officially documented. For single mothers, institutional pressure favored surrendering the child to the system. Lebensborn officers oversaw controlled adoptions to selected SS families, deliberately severing biological ties in favor of ideological criteria. Mothers who insisted on raising their children faced significant restrictions: constant supervision, controlled education, and periodic evaluations of racial progress. The fundamental objective: to subordinate the maternal bond to ideological commitment. In some concentration camps operated by the SS between 1943 and 1945, attempts at natural reproduction were documented among prisoners selected for their physical characteristics. Unlike the Lebensborn system or mass surgical sterilization programs, these practices were not aimed at directly intervening on the body through medical procedures, but rather at forcing sexual unions under controlled conditions, with the aim of observing spontaneous biological results. At Auschwitz and Natzweiler-Struthof, separate barracks were set up where men and women were paired by SS officers. Individuals were selected after basic physical examinations based on age, general health, and traits considered favorable from a racial perspective. There was no prior consent or communication between the parties. Women were assigned contact shifts with a single man for several weeks. If no signs of pregnancy were detected after this period, they were replaced by others. The officers in charge of monitoring submitted written reports detailing general observations, the conduct of those involved, compliance with appointments, and the availability or absence of results. No clinical tests were performed, nor was medical care offered during the process. Conditions were rudimentary. The meetings took place on bare cots, in rooms with no privacy, sometimes with guards present. Prisoners who refused to participate were punished by being transferred to dangerous labor, or pairings were made between German men convicted of common crimes and Slavic or Jewish women selected from the captive population. The couples were relocated for the duration of the trial. The birth of a fit child was considered a positive outcome. If the newborn did not meet visible standards, hair color, skull shape, complexion, he or she was immediately removed. No detailed records of his or her subsequent fate survive. In other smaller subcamps, a variation on this procedure was tried: forced natural insemination through repeated exposure to several men within the same day. These practices did not respond to medical protocols, but rather to oral directives transmitted by local supervisors. Documentation found at the end of the war includes fragmentary mentions of passive reproductive observation, without specifying the exact number of victims. Some accounts, collected by Soviet researchers in 1945, refer to the use of this type of pairing in secondary facilities near factories operated by the IG Farben conglomerate. In these cases, the pairings were intended to assess whether prolonged physical fatigue or exposure to industrial substances affected fertility. Women were required to work 12-hour shifts and then report to the mating block without interruption. There was no medical assistance and no possibility of refusing the procedure. These practices were not part of the formal institutional reproductive system. They were carried out in a scattered manner at the discretion of subordinate officers or physicians interested in producing observational data on racial fertility. No references to these experiments are found in the central administrative structures of the Reich. Their existence was confirmed through secondary records, marginal correspondence, and some records recovered from medical archives partially destroyed during the German retreat. The fragmentary nature of these operations prevented their inclusion in the major post-war judicial proceedings. In most cases, neither the victims survived nor was sufficient documentation preserved to structure formal charges. However, cross-referencing data between fields, matchmaking lists, and internal notes allows us to partially reconstruct a systematic practice of forced reproduction devoid of any effective, institutional, or medical purpose. In these settings, the human body was reduced to strict functionality, a racial compatibility test performed without instruments, anesthesia, or language. Child abduction was the most extreme dimension. Specific SS teams, assisted by racial anthropologists, examined children in occupied territories, particularly Poland, Ukraine, and Czechoslovakia. Those with racially exploitable characteristics were separated from their families and transferred to Germanization centers. Administrative documents used technical terminology. These abductions were classified as recovery of lost German blood. The Germanization process followed strict protocols, prohibition of the mother tongue, assignment of new German names, and intensive ideological re-education. Later research estimates that approximately 200,000 children were processed through this system. The post-war return rate did not exceed 15% due to the deliberate destruction of original identity records and early integration into German families. Elsa K., a young Polish woman forcibly recruited into the program in 1942, left this testimony. "I was informed that I had exceptional Aryan traits and that my duty was to produce children for the Reich. When I refused, my father was arrested. The local commander offered me two alternatives: cooperate or see my family deported to the east. For 9 months, I lived in a facility near Dresden. The son I had there was immediately removed. I never saw him again." In the Lebensborn centers, women experienced a calculated paradox. They received exceptional material privileges, superior nutrition, exclusive medical care, comfortable surroundings, while being stripped of all personal autonomy. This duality reflected the regime's fundamental perspective. The value of the female body resided exclusively in its reproductive function, while individual will was systematically suppressed. At the end of the war, the liberation of Lebensborn facilities revealed the full extent of the program. Allied researchers discovered meticulous records, racial classifications, genetic records, reproductive compatibility assessments, and offspring tracking, all under official seals that transformed human reproduction into a state function. The subsequent fate of the Lebensborn children constituted an additional tragedy. In Norway, they were stigmatized as children of the enemy and frequently committed to psychiatric collaborators, faced public humiliation and permanent marginalization. In Germany, many grew up without knowing their origins, with falsified identities to conceal their involvement in the program. Only in recent years have some states begun to officially recognize this historical injustice. The legacy of the Lebensborn program transcends individual harm. It represented the logical culmination of Nazi racial ideology, the complete industrialization of human reproduction, where even motherhood was subordinated to abstract racial criteria. Its implementation demonstrated how the seemingly academic concepts of eugenics and racial hygiene could be transformed into unprecedented administrative systems of reproductive control. Evil Dome, the dark desires of the Reich leaders. Behind the imposing facade of the Third Reich lay lives marked by profound contradictions between public doctrine and private behavior. The same leaders who issued draconian decrees on sexual morality maintained personal practices radically inconsistent with their official rhetoric. This dissonance between proclaimed ideology and actual behavior reveals fundamental dimensions of the regime's inner workings. Adolf Hitler meticulously cultivated a public image of absolute austerity. Presented by propaganda as a celibate figure dedicated exclusively to Germany, his personal life remained carefully hidden. This media construction responded to specific needs. The projection of an almost monastic figure reinforced his charismatic authority and distanced him from ordinary human vulnerabilities. The reality was starkly different. Medical records discovered after the war suggested physical problems that may have influenced his sexual behavior. Clinical reports mention monorchidism, absence of one testicle, and possible related dysfunctions. Testimonies from his close circle confirm extreme discomfort during medical examinations and a pathological concern about his physicality. His relationship with Eva Braun exemplifies the obsessive control characteristic of his personal relationships. Braun lived virtually secluded in the Berghof without official recognition for years. Private correspondence between the two reveals a dynamic in which Hitler dictated every aspect of Braun's existence, from clothing to permitted reading material. Significantly, he only married her hours before their mutual suicide, when public image had become irrelevant. The most murky episode involved his niece, Geli Raubel. When Hitler was 40, 21-year-old Geli moved into his apartment in Munich. The control he exerted was absolute. He supervised her movements, censored her correspondence, and monitored her friendships. In 1931, Geli committed suicide with Hitler's personal pistol. Close witnesses describe this event as causing the only visible emotional crisis in the dictator's public life. Rudolf Hess, designated as his successor until his unauthorized flight to Scotland in 1941, represents another manifestation of the complex sexuality of the Nazi inner circle. His marriage to Ilse Pröll began as a prolonged platonic relationship. Personal documents reveal that the connection that ultimately cemented their union was not intimate compatibility, but rather a shared admiration for Hitler. Attending speeches by the future dictator together formed the primary bond between them. The Hess-Pröll marriage occurred through the direct intervention of Hitler, who unilaterally announced during a private dinner that they should marry. The couple remained notoriously distant physically for years, until party pressure to project a normal family life resulted in the birth of a son. This direct interference in the personal relationships of subordinates characterized Hitler's leadership style, where intimate matters were subordinated to political needs. Hess's devotion to Hitler transcended conventional loyalty. Documents recovered from British archives contain references to feelings Hess explicitly described as love for his Führer. This emotional intensity generated ridicule among the Nazi hierarchy, where she was nicknamed Fräulein Hess for her attitude, perceived as excessively servile and emotionally dependent. Heinrich Himmler embodied particularly acute contradictions. Physically distant from the Aryan ideal he proclaimed, short, nearsighted, and weakly built, he built his identity on obsessions with racial and sexual purity. During his youth, he publicly promoted absolute abstinence. He did not have intimate relations until he was 28, an unusual fact that contrasted with the male hypersexualization promoted by sectors of the party. As Supreme Commander of the SS, Himmler imposed draconian moral standards on his subordinates while simultaneously maintaining a double life. Despite his rhetoric about traditional family values, he engaged in an extramarital affair with his secretary, Hedwig Potthast, with whom he had 2 children. This hypocrisy extended institutionally. He required racial purity certificates for marriages of SS officers while personally authorizing state-controlled brothels. The most documented case of sexual experimentation within the Nazi leadership involves Martin and Gerda Bormann. Head of the party chancellery, Bormann enjoyed Hitler's absolute trust, while his wife, Gerda, developed radical theories about Aryan family structure. A devoted fanatic, she openly advocated polygamy as a mechanism to accelerate reveals an extraordinary family model. Gerda not only tolerated marital infidelity, but actively encouraged it. Referring to her husband's mistress, the actress Manja Verens, she wrote, "Just make sure she has a child this year and I next, always guaranteeing a fertile woman at your disposal." This stance reflected not subservience, but ideological conviction. Gerda considered monogamy an obstacle to German racial expansion. Her commitment to this vision was demonstrated by 10 pregnancies between 1930 and 1943, and she received the party's Gold Medal for motherhood. Hitler personally sponsored her firstborn son, named Martin Adolf. In subsequent correspondence, Gerda proposed legally formalizing polygamy after the victory, indicating that Hitler himself shared this perspective. These dynamics reveal how sexuality functioned primarily as a political instrument. The wives of Nazi leaders operated as extensions of the ideological apparatus, subject to strict control over appearance, public behavior, and reproductive function. Paradoxically, many privately transgressed the role model they publicly represented. Alongside the public discourse of chastity, moral order, and Germanic austerity, an opaque network of private sexual consumption flourished in the highest spheres of the Reich, sustained by the expropriation of bodies and symbols. Various Allied intelligence reports documented how villas confiscated from Jewish aristocrats, Czech industrialists, or Polish nobles were repurposed as recreational spaces for high-ranking officials. Many of them housed personal collections of erotic art, libraries of prohibited sexual literature, and furniture adapted for systematic intimate practices, far from the scrutiny of the party or the disciplinary apparatus. Sexuality functioned as a status symbol and a form of political capital within the Nazi hierarchy. As they rose through the ranks, certain officials gained access to closed circles where control of other people's bodies was part of the implicit privileges. Women were not integrated as companions or social figures, but rather as functional components of the private sphere of power, integrated into the ideological and ornamental apparatus of those who had transformed violence into the aesthetics of domination. The accumulation of pornography also reached systematic levels. The Sonderauftrag Linz, initially created to recover masterpieces of European art, progressively included erotic graphic material confiscated in Paris, Vienna, and Brussels. Although some was destroyed for being considered degenerate, others were preserved in private collections of figures such as Hermann Göring, Hans Frank, and Ernst Kaltenbrunner. An inventory of more than 600 images classified by sexual theme was found in the archives of the Reich Chancellery. These images were registered for the so-called Cultural Re-Education Archive, although they were never exhibited or mentioned publicly. In addition to the archive, there was a circuit of private events where the staging of power included sexual appropriation as a spectacle. Properties used by members of the Nazi elite, especially in Saxony, Bavaria, and Tyrol, served as venues for meetings organized on specific dates. During these gatherings, reported as diplomatic evenings or official celebrations, wine, live music, and private access to women recruited based on age and appearance were offered. The pre-selection process was verified by military doctors who certified the participants' physical condition, maintaining a facade of health order while institutionalizing discretionary sexual access based on hierarchical rank. The case of Wewelsburg Castle, the ceremonial headquarters of the SS, illustrates this symbolic dimension of abuse. Although conceived as an ideological center, it was also used for private celebrations on ritual dates linked to the National Socialist calendar. Logistical documents detail architectural adaptations for these gatherings: rooms equipped with antibacterial materials, blackout curtains, a secondary entrance for the transport of special visitors, and furniture adapted for intimate interaction in ritualized spaces. In the final months of the regime, as the military machine collapsed, various leaders attempted to preserve their archives, possessions, and sexual collections as part of their personal legacy. Trains transporting gold artwork and priority documentation also included erotic albums, coded diaries, and personal objects linked to rituals of private domain. This effort to protect symbols of intimate power reveals that for many within the Nazi leadership, sexual control was not an incidental excess, but a natural extension of the ideological mandate: the body as spoils, desire as the architecture. Controlling sexuality was the logical consequence of their totalitarian vision. Intimate life was transformed into another expression of absolute power. This distortion reached its peak in the fundamental hypocrisy that characterized the regime. While imposing strict standards of public morality, its leaders lived by entirely different rules, revealing the complete instrumentalization of sexuality as a tool of social and political control. The enemy's revenge, Germans turned into loot. During the final months of World War II, as the Third Reich collapsed, an unprecedented wave of sexual violence against the German civilian population unfolded. The Soviet advance toward Berlin unleashed widespread terror that tragically would find justification in reality. Between April and May 1945, approximately 130,000 Berlin women were raped during the initial occupation, in a historic turning point that transformed the citizens of Hitler's empire into victims of victorious revenge. Leonie Bialas, then a 14-year-old teenager in Breslau, now Wrocław, describes the moment with traumatic precision. "We were in Uncle Reinhold's cellar. Soldiers suddenly burst in. One came in, looked around, saw me, and violently pulled me out. My mother screamed. I still remember exactly how he threw me to the floor. And then, right on the threshold, it happened." Unlike the sexual violence perpetrated by German forces in occupied territories, these attacks did not follow a structured ideological plan. They represented the convergence of multiple factors: revenge for German atrocities committed on Soviet soil, a culture of military impunity, massive alcohol consumption, and resentment accumulated during years of destructive war. Testimonies indicate that Soviet officers frequently ignored or even encouraged this behavior as compensation for previous suffering. The geographical extent of the phenomenon is significant. While rapes in Berlin have received greater historical attention, regions such as East Prussia experienced even more extreme situations. During the winter evacuation of 1945, columns of civilian refugees were systematically intercepted. Women were separated, assaulted by multiple soldiers, and subsequently abandoned in critical conditions, often in sub-zero temperatures. The most revealing document of this reality is the anonymous diary "A Woman in Berlin," published decades later. Its author, an educated journalist, describes survival strategies developed in the face of inevitable violence. "After being repeatedly assaulted by ordinary soldiers, I realized I needed sustainable protection. Identifying a high-ranking officer willing to claim me as his exclusive property represented the only possible defense against multiple and random rapes." This negotiation of one's own body as a defensive mechanism reflects the absolute vulnerability experienced by the female population. Although the majority of documented attacks were perpetrated by Soviet troops, substantial evidence confirms the involvement of Western forces. Church documents, hospital reports, and personal testimony verify rapes committed by American and French soldiers, particularly in Bavaria, Baden, and the Rhineland. French colonial units, especially North African regiments, generated specific terror in rural communities in southwestern Germany. In Landshut, little Margot witnessed American soldiers attack her grandmother after discovering a German military uniform in her home. This incident remained buried in family silence until, decades later, Margot shared her experience with her daughter Maximiliana. Thousands of similar cases remain undocumented, known only within family circles who preferred silence as a social survival strategy. The immediate consequences were catastrophic. Berlin medical facilities reported an epidemic of genital lesions and the massive spread of venereal diseases. Suicide rates reached historic highs. During April-May 1945, more than 3,800 Berliners, mostly women, took their own lives. Thousands of unwanted pregnancies resulted in clandestine abortions performed under unsafe conditions, causing fatal infections and prolonged complications. The transgenerational consequences of this mass violence took multiple forms. Konrad Jahr, born after being raped by an American soldier in Altenburg and immediately given up for adoption, constructed a compensatory fantasy throughout his childhood. "I had a secret that gave me strength. One day I will go to America and find my real father." Meanwhile, Anna Rosa Adam, the daughter of a French soldier and a German mother, was sent to France at the age of 10 without prior consultation, considered property of the French state. Her testimony reveals another aspect of the trauma. "They sent me to a foreign country with an unknown language to live with nuns. No one ever asked my opinion." These cases illustrate how the political exploitation of these victims prolonged the damage far beyond the Allied advance. Various local administrations within German territory began issuing internal circulars related to the sexual disorder unleashed by the occupation. In municipal archives in cities such as Halle, Magdeburg, and Chemnitz, documents signed by mayors or health authorities were found requesting support for civil containment in the face of moral instability caused by the foreign military presence. Some of these memoranda included recommendations to prevent single women from traveling around at night, the creation of makeshift shelters, and the temporary closure of schools converted into community shelters. The administrations lacked resources and real authority, but they left written records of a phenomenon they recognized as uncontrollable. Church organizations also attempted to respond. Catholic and Protestant parishes issued confidential letters to regional dioceses reporting incidents of violence against female parishioners. In several southern regions, convents offered temporary protection to young women by hiding them during patrols. In Paderborn, a group of nuns requested logistical support from the Vatican to transport girls to Italian facilities. The request was filed without response. In Bavaria, the bishopric of Passau compiled a 37-page report on cases of assault recorded between April and June 1945, which was confidentially submitted to Allied representatives. It included an anonymous list of forced pregnancies, the physical conditions of the victims, and proposals for temporary separation by age and gender in collective shelters. In Berlin, university hospitals received more than 12,000 women with genital injuries between May and July 1945. Gynecology wards were overcrowded and available treatments were limited to internal lavage, penicillin injections, and delayed administration of sulfur drugs. There was no standardized protocol, and most medical records were kept by hand by improvised personnel. In Leipzig and Dresden, where Soviet units remained longer, emergency wards for rape victims were established, but their existence was omitted from official Red Army reports. Helke Sander's 1992 documentary Befreier und Befreiter marked a turning point, presenting first-hand accounts from survivors and children of the occupation. The director observed a consistent pattern. The women were not accustomed to expressing personal experiences. If they tried to speak out, they faced renewed victimization. Many indicated that the subsequent family conflict was more traumatic than the original assault. Recent historical research establishes that approximately 900,000 German women were raped during this period, many repeatedly. This figure, although shocking, remains conservative given the nature of the crime and associated taboos. The war thus brought a complete circle of violence to a close. Nazism's predatory sexual policies found a dark reflection in crimes perpetrated against civilians the regime had sworn to protect. The silencing of these experiences for decades reflects complexities of historical memory and collective responsibility. German society, confronting its own criminal past, found it difficult to simultaneously process the suffering of its citizens. This dynamic left entire generations without an adequate vocabulary to articulate personal traumas within the broader context of the European catastrophe. Pink Triangle, the silent extermination of homosexuals. During the Weimar Republic, Berlin was home to one of the most visible gay communities in Europe. The Institute for Sexual Research, directed by Magnus Hirschfeld, represented a global scientific vanguard in studies on sexual diversity. This relative openness contrasted radically with the persecution that would follow, creating one of the fundamental contradictions of the emerging National Socialist movement. Ernst Röhm, founder and commander of the SA Sturmabteilung or Brown Shirts, personified this initial paradox. A decorated veteran of World War I, he established the SA as a paramilitary force dedicated to protecting party meetings, intimidating opponents, and fighting in the streets. Under his leadership, it grew into a private army of several million, potentially more powerful than the regular armed forces. The extraordinary thing, Röhm was openly homosexual. He maintained relationships with subordinates and frequented gay bars in Munich and Berlin without any particular discretion. His orientation was known within party circles, including Hitler himself, who initially tolerated it with political pragmatism. Röhm's private life is his own business as long as he keeps his organization disciplined. The SA developed an internal culture where militarized homoeroticism paradoxically coexisted with political brutality. Their barracks, characterized by intense physical camaraderie and exclusive masculinity, generated environments where body admiration, the cult of strength, and intense emotional bonds between men constituted everyday normalcy. This dynamic directly contradicted the moral public image the party promoted among the general population. The provisional tolerance of homosexuality within powerful circles ended abruptly in 1934. Hitler, now Chancellor, was facing a political crisis. Röhm and the SA were demanding greater prominence and threatening the crucial alliance with the regular army, which deeply distrusted ideologized paramilitaries. At the same time, Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS, initially subordinate to the SA, sought to eliminate institutional competition. Röhm's homosexuality provided the perfect justification. Himmler and Joseph Goebbels convinced Hitler that this degeneration compromised the moral integrity of the movement and justified an immediate purge. The moral motivation masked political calculations, neutralizing internal threats, consolidating control over the paramilitary apparatus, and eliminating institutional competitors. On the night of June 30th to July 2nd, 1934, known as the Night of the Long Knives, SS squads executed more than 85 SA leaders, including Röhm. While detained in a hotel, he was offered suicide with a pistol provided in his cell. After refusing, he was executed by 2 SS officers. Official propaganda immediately provided the moral justification. Those killed represented a homosexual conspiracy against the Reich. This turning point marked the beginning of systematic persecution. The regime radically modified paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code, in force since 1871. The original version criminalized specific sexual acts. The Nazi revision expanded the criminalization to include any physical contact, glances, or even thoughts considered homoerotic. Simultaneously, penalties increased exponentially. Whereas previously the typical sentence was 3 months, under Nazi legislation, it could reach 10 years of hard labor. The persecution took on an institutional structure. The Gestapo established a specialized department, Sonderdezernat, dedicated exclusively to identifying and prosecuting homosexuals. This unit meticulously compiled pink lists of suspects, organized raids on known meeting places, and infiltrated agents into clandestine spaces. Investigative methods included postal interception, house surveillance, and extortion techniques to obtain additional names. On May 6, 1933, stormtroopers destroyed the Institute for Sexual Research. Thousands of scientific books and research documents were publicly burned on Berlin's Opernplatz. The Institute's archives containing medical records and personal information about patients were handed over to the authorities, facilitating the identification of potential victims. Between 1935 and 1945, approximately 100,000 men were arrested on suspicion of homosexuality. Of these, about 50,000 received prison sentences, and at least 15,000 were deported to concentration camps. There they wore a specific badge, a pink triangle sewn onto their clothing, which identified them within the concentration camp system as particularly despicable. The internal hierarchy of the camps placed homosexual prisoners in a particularly vulnerable position. They received the most dangerous jobs, inferior rations, isolated to prevent moral contamination. Even within the pervasive horror of the system, these prisoners faced additional discrimination from both guards and other inmates, creating conditions of almost total isolation. At Sachsenhausen, a special block was established for homosexual prisoners where medical experiments were conducted aimed at curing their sexual orientation. These included forced administration of high doses of hormones that caused permanent organ damage, surgical implantation of synthetic capsules, and aversion therapies using electric shocks. As a therapeutic alternative, some prisoners were subjected to voluntary castration to reduce their sentences or avoid lethal labor. SS doctors conceptualized homosexuality as a contagious social disease requiring radical intervention. Carl Vernet, a Danish doctor and collaborator of the regime, developed experimental hormonal implants at Buchenwald that frequently caused fatal fevers and deaths from sepsis. These procedures were officially presented as scientific reconstructive therapy, receiving personal authorization from Himmler for program expansion. Himmler's obsession with persecuting homosexuality responded primarily to demographic, not moral calculations. In a confidential speech to SS commanders in Bad Tölz, 1937, he clearly articulated this view. A nation of good race with a high birth rate is assured of power. A nation with an insufficient birth rate faces extinction. For him, homosexuality represented above all a threat to male reproductive potential, jeopardizing the Reich's population. Explains the intensification of persecution during the war, when, starting in 1941, the summary execution of SS members discovered engaging in homosexual behavior was authorized, and deportations to camps increased proportionally to the war crisis. Pierre Seal, a French deportee to Schirmeck-Vorbrück, recounted a paradigmatic experience. He was forced to witness his 18-year-old partner being attacked by guard dogs while SS officers looked on. These specific atrocities sought to destroy not only individuals, but also the potential for solidarity, affection, or community resistance. Paragraph 175 remained in effect in both Germanys for decades. In West Germany, the Nazi version of the law continued unchanged until 1969. Many survivors were transferred directly from camps to state prisons to complete previous sentences, transforming release into a simple administrative transfer. Unlike other victimized groups, they received no recognition or compensation during the immediate post-war period. Claims for compensation were systematically rejected on the grounds that they had been legitimately convicted criminals. This stigma persisted institutionally. During a parliamentary debate on reparations, 1950, a government representative explicitly argued that those who would still be sent to prison today lacked compensatory legitimacy. The historical silencing remained almost complete until recent decades. It wasn't until 1985 that German President Richard von Weizsäcker first publicly mentioned homosexual victims in an official speech. The formal annulment of sentences didn't come until 2002, when most survivors had already died. A national memorial dedicated specifically to this group was inaugurated in Berlin in 2008. The persecution of homosexuals under Nazism reveals a fundamental contradiction. A regime that aesthetically exalted idealized masculinity, virile camaraderie, and intense bonds between men simultaneously persecuted any emotional manifestation within that paradigm. This dissonance represented a perfect microcosm of the structural hypocrisy of a system where appearance and reality diverged radically, with lethal consequences for those caught between the two dimensions. Clinical terror, the Reich's sexual experiments. The medical machinery of the Third Reich transformed scientific knowledge into an instrument of institutionalized sexual violence. Under legitimate academic authority, doctors trained at prestigious European universities turned human bodies into living laboratories where reproductive biology and sexual anatomy were systematically manipulated for political and racial purposes. This represents the culmination of the systems of bodily control described in previous chapters, where medical intervention provided scientific justification for practices that, in essence, were extensions of the sexual and reproductive violence inherent in the National Socialist project. Auschwitz-Birkenau functioned simultaneously as an extermination center and an experimental laboratory without ethical restrictions. Josef Mengele, who earned a doctorate in physical anthropology and medicine from the University of Munich, implemented his racial theories there through direct interventions on human bodies. Although his twin studies have received greater historical attention, he simultaneously developed a systematic program focused on female reproductive physiology. In specialized medical barracks, he personally selected young women for experiments that included injections of experimental chemicals into the cervix and forced insemination protocols combined with prior sterilization. These interventions, carried out without anesthesia, sterilized equipment, or minimal hygienic conditions, caused extreme pain, massive infections, and frequently death. Karl Klauberg, a gynecologist trained in elite medical institutions, developed the mass sterilization method by injecting formaldehyde into the fallopian tubes at Ravensbrück and Auschwitz. The procedure, performed without anesthesia, caused debilitating abdominal pain, high fever, and frequently internal organ perforation. Document 1247 PS, recovered from SS archives, explicitly states the objective, an efficient method for sterilizing massively and without the knowledge of those affected populations, considered racially undesirable. Correspondence between Klauberg and Himmler reveals a specific operational priority: the development of an externally undetectable procedure, allowing for subsequent labor use without prior sterilization. This feature was significant for post-conflict planning. Processed women would be deported as labor without reproductive capacity, eliminating demographic risk while maintaining economic functionality. Helena S., a Polish survivor, testified before Soviet investigators, May 1945. They lined us up naked in front of doctors and officers. After selection, they injected a burning substance internally, pain comparable to liquid fire. Many lost consciousness immediately, others never returned. We were forbidden to talk about the procedure under threat of immediate execution. At the same time, diverse experimental practices existed. At Buchenwald, Block 46 housed research on sexual behavior under altered hormonal conditions. Selected prisoners received injections of compounds derived primarily from bovine and porcine testicles. Behavioral modifications were subsequently documented through direct observation and forced questionnaires. These data fueled pseudoscientific theories about the biological determinism of sexual behavior. Experimental methodology frequently included controlled stress sexual response tests. Experimental subjects were subjected to sensory deprivation, irregular feeding, extreme temperatures, and induced exhaustion, while their response to sexual stimuli was monitored. These protocols, initially designed for military application, sought to identify psychophysical endurance thresholds and psychological breaking points with potential applicability in advanced interrogations. The transformation of sexual violence into legitimate scientific research required a sophisticated conceptual and administrative apparatus. Far from being individual excesses, these crimes enjoyed full institutional backing. Detailed protocols, standardized forms, a clearly defined chain of command, and periodic review procedures. This structure allowed human suffering to be transformed into clinical data using technical language that eliminated any ethical considerations or recognition of the pain caused. The Nazi obsession with reproductive control transcended merely tactical objectives to reveal a long-term strategic vision. For the Reich's medical establishment, mastering reproductive mechanisms meant controlling the biological future of entire populations. From the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute explicitly expressed the need for scientific domination over the non-Germanic racial reproductive capacity as a strategic prerequisite for sustainable Aryan biological supremacy. Within this conceptual framework, female reproductive organs acquired specific strategic value, literally described in SS documentation as the final battleground in the racial conflict. The consequences persisted beyond liberation. Thousands of survivors were left with permanent gynecological injuries, irreversible sterility, and profound psychological trauma. Allied medical reports, 1945 to 1946, document specific symptom patterns: severe sexual phobias, dissociative disorders that impeded normal intimacy, and self-injurious behaviors specifically directed toward the genitals, indicating persistent traumatic internalization. The subsequent fate of perpetrators illustrates the imperfections of post-war justice. While some Nazi doctors faced trial and execution, many escaped or received surprisingly light sentences. Particularly disturbing cases involved continued professional service at prestigious Western institutions. Karl Klauberg, released from Soviet prison, 1955, attempted to reopen a private gynecological practice, publicly promoting his scientific advances, until protests from survivors forced research, which was cut short by his death, 1957. Herta Oberheiser worked as a family doctor in Schleswig-Holstein until 1956, when a survivor accidentally recognized her. Although she lost her medical license, she avoided serving her original sentence, living freely until 1978 while consistently denying any wrongdoing. Confiscated experimental archives followed complex post-war trajectories. While some documents served as evidence in the Nuremberg trials, others were appropriated by Western and Soviet intelligence services, assessing their potential military scientific value. Specific documentation on controlled fertility and reproductive experimentation remained classified until the 1990s, indicating lingering sensitivity regarding potential applicability. This medical violence represents a catastrophic failure of science divorced from essential ethical constraints. The Nazi experiments continue to raise fundamental questions about research boundaries, informed consent, and institutional oversight of biomedical science. Particularly disturbing, these crimes were perpetrated not by the ignorant but by the European intellectual elite, demonstrating how sophisticated anatomical knowledge can be transformed into a sophisticated instrument of torture when ideology replaces the fundamental principle of non-maleficence.